Imagine being a baby and learning one terrifying rule. Nobody comes when you cry. Not once in a while. Almost never. Your brain is built during the first years of life, and it doesn't build itself in a vacuum. It builds itself around people. Around faces, voices, touch. The tiny back and forth moments where you make a sound and someone answers. Now imagine removing that entire conversation. That is what happened to thousands of children in Romania. And years later, a group of scientists faced a question that sounds almost impossible to ask. If a child is rescued from that environment, how much can the brain recover? The answer changed how we think about childhood, attachment, and even what neglect really means. But there's a darker part of the story. To get that answer, researchers had to run a study that many people believe should never have been run at all. So let's go back to the beginning. In the late 1960s, Romania's dictator Nicolae Ceausescu wanted the country to grow. His government severely restricted abortion and contraception. Births surged, but the economy couldn't support every family. So many children ended up in state-run institutions. On paper, these places could look functional. There was food, medical care, clean clothes, and records. But there wasn't enough of one thing: a person. One caregiver might be responsible for a long row of infants. Imagine trying to comfort 10, 12, or 15 babies at the same time. You can't. So a child cries. Nobody comes. The child cries again. Still nothing. Eventually, something changes. The child stops expecting an answer. Visitors to these institutions were often disturbed by how quiet the wards could be. But quiet didn't mean peaceful. It could mean the children had learned that calling out was useless. Some children rocked themselves for hours. Some stared blankly. Some showed unusual social behavior around strangers. And when Romania's regime collapsed in 1989, the world finally saw what had been happening. The obvious question was, can this damage be reversed? That question led to one of the most important and controversial child development studies ever conducted. The Bucharest Early Intervention Project began around the turn of the century. Researchers followed 136 young children who had been raised in institutions. Some were randomly assigned to specially created foster care families. Others remained in institutional care. That random assignment mattered. If researchers simply compared adopted children with institutionalized children, critics could say, maybe the children who got families were healthier from the beginning. Random assignment made that explanation much harder to use. And then the measurements started. Researchers looked at development, language, attachment, and brain activity. The differences were hard to ignore. Children who had spent their early lives in institutions often showed lower cognitive scores and unusual patterns of brain activity. But one of the strangest findings involved attachment. A young child normally learns that certain people are safe: mom, dad, a grandparent, a caregiver, someone specific. But some institutionalized children seemed equally comfortable approaching almost any adult. They might reach for a stranger's hand or climb into an unfamiliar person's lap. That sounds friendly. It isn't necessarily. It's a clue that the child hasn't learned that one particular adult is their secure base. Then came the part that made the study famous. Children moved into stable families began improving in language, cognition, and attachment. But the timing mattered. Children placed earlier generally showed much stronger recovery than children who spent longer periods in institutional care. This pointed towards something neuroscientists call a sensitive period. Think of it as a stretch of time when the brain is especially ready to be shaped by experience. And early childhood is one of those periods. That doesn't mean a child's future is permanently decided by their second birthday. Brains remain changeable throughout life. But early deprivation can leave deeper effects, and earlier intervention tends to give children a better chance to recover. That's the crucial distinction. The brain is flexible. But flexibility isn't infinite. And the researchers found that the effects weren't limited to behavior. Brain scans suggested differences in both gray matter and white matter, the tissue involved in processing information and connecting different brain regions. Some changes showed signs of recovery after children entered better environments. Others were more persistent. The same story appeared in their brains, behavior, and development. Then came an even stranger question. Could early neglect affect the body itself? Researchers found evidence of differences in biological aging and stress regulation among children who had experienced severe early deprivation. In other words, the environment wasn't simply changing how these children behaved. It was getting under the skin. And that brings us to a word that sounds almost harmless: neglect. We usually imagine neglect as something bad that happens. But technically, neglect can be something that doesn't happen. Nobody hits the child. Nobody screams. Nobody intentionally hurts them. The child gets fed. The child gets cleaned. The child gets medicine. And yet something essential is missing. Responsive human contact. A baby isn't just waiting for calories. They're learning what the world is. When they cry and someone responds, the lesson is simple: my signals matter. When they reach and someone reaches back, other people can be trusted. When they make a sound and another person answers, communication works. Millions of tiny interactions build that expectation. And here's the twist: the key isn't perfect parenting or expensive toys. It's repeated response. Someone keeps showing up. That is why this story is much bigger than Romanian orphanages. Because you had a beginning too. Before you could remember a single day, your brain was collecting evidence about the world. When you cried, did someone come? When you looked at a face, did the face look back? When you reached out, did somebody reach back? You don't remember most of those moments, but your brain was there. And it was learning. This is also why the study became so ethically explosive. The children couldn't consent. They were too young. The institutions were controlled by the Romanian state, which also served as their legal guardian. Researchers knew from previous evidence that institutional deprivation could be harmful, and yet some children remained in institutional care as a comparison group. Critics argued that this crossed an ethical line. The scientists were observing harm that they already expected. The researchers and their defenders argued that the study was conducted with government and university approval, that foster care was being created where it barely existed, and that the findings could help transform a system harming far more children. There is no clean answer here. That's what makes the story uncomfortable. If the study had never happened, we might know less about how powerful early caregiving can be. Because it did happen, 136 children became part of evidence that influenced policy and child welfare thinking. The research helped strengthen the case for moving young children out of large institutions and into family-based care. And that idea spread far beyond Romania. But the deepest lesson isn't about one country. It's about how humans develop. A baby's brain isn't a finished machine waiting to be turned on. It's more like a construction site. Experience supplies the instructions. Every interaction adds another piece. Every response teaches the brain what to expect next. And when the expected response never arrives, the brain adapts to that reality too. That's the uncomfortable part. The brain doesn't ask whether your childhood was fair. It asks what kind of world it needs to survive. If the world is responsive, you learn to reach. If the world is unpredictable, you learn to watch. If the world is consistently unresponsive, you may learn not to call. Those adaptations can become patterns that follow you for years. But adaptation is not destiny. That matters. The same research that showed how damaging deprivation can be also showed that better environments can produce real recovery. Children are not broken machines. They are changing systems. And changing systems can change again. So when you think about your own personality, don't imagine it as something that simply appeared inside your head. Some of it may be ancient biology. Some of it may be temperament. And some of it was built through thousands of tiny interactions you don't remember. Someone answered. Someone didn't. Someone stayed. Someone disappeared. Long before you had words for safety, your brain was already trying to define it. That's why the story of those children is so haunting. They didn't need more stuff. They needed a person. Not a perfect person. A present one. And maybe that's the simplest lesson hidden inside all the complicated science. A human brain can survive many things. But it was built to grow in relationship with another human being. Someone shows up. You call. They answer. And somewhere inside that tiny exchange, a brain learns what the world is. Your personality may feel like it was written by you. But the first draft was written by everyone who answered when you called.